So we don't want to waste any time this afternoon, so I'm going to pass it over to the man of the moment. He is a very well-rounded expert doing a lot of great work in the field of plastic pollution, and of course his name is Mr. Ronald Roach, and Ali rename me there, Ronald. Sir Ronald Roach is a Trinidadian consultant with 20 years of professional experience and expertise in the waste and wastewater management field, and is the director of the Wastewater and Sanitization Department at Unite Caribbean. He has carried out multi-sectoral diagnoses in many Caribbean countries, conducted characterization studies, developed collection, storage, and recovery plans, and implemented various technological solutions, taking into account institutional, human, financial, and environmental aspects. He has in-depth knowledge of the challenges and obstacles specific to waste management and recovery in the Caribbean basin, having worked on waste and wastewater infrastructure projects in Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, and OECS countries. His latest assignments are the Recycle OECS project, which seeks to develop a model recycling system for the OECS countries. So, passing it over to you, Ronald.
Yes, thank you so very much, Tyrell, and thank you to all the participants. So just allow me to share my screen. Can you confirm that you guys are seeing my screen in presentation mode?
Yes.
Yep. Great. So today we are talking about plastic waste and reducing plastic waste in the Caribbean region. Just to introduce you to the Unite Caribbean Group, we are a consulting firm founded in 2017, and our work is to support the Caribbean organizations to develop their economic, social, environmental capacity and to assess regional and international markets. And we work in 4 thematic areas: climate resilience and environment, public local governance, civil society capacity building, water, waste, and circular economy, which is where I belong, and social and economic development. And we have offices in Guadeloupe and St. Lucia as our main offices, and then we work out of Haiti, St. Martin, and Trinidad. And we are a bunch of 16 professionals in the company. So let's start with our Instagram moment. So the typical Caribbean, beautiful seas, lush green forests, and so. And then we get to the reality on the ground. When we just look at the surface, this is what we see. So this is actually typical Caribbean. Some places are better than others, but the reality is that pollution, and especially plastic pollution, plagues us all. In some countries, you will see it being very pristine, and it's not because it's naturally that way. It's because the countries themselves, for various reasons, including the tourism activities, they put out quite a bit of effort to keep the country clean. So let's talk about plastics. Despite our concern for plastics and despite plastic pollution being highlighted as a major concern throughout the world, the reality is plastic production continues to increase. And from the graph there, you can see it is increasing almost exponentially, if not exponentially. Plastic, what is plastic? It's a material consisting of any of a wide range of synthetic or semi-synthetic organic compounds that are malleable so that can be molded into a solid object. What we need to realize, though, is that whilst we, classify plastics and we talk about plastics holistically, the fact is that it's really a series of different materials, and for the purposes of recycling, there's this classification of 6+1, 6 being polyethylene terephthalate, and that is the material that comprises your water bottles and your soft drink bottles in particular. Then there's high density polyethylene, your milk and juice jugs and shampoo bottles and so forth. PVC, which would be some of your cosmetic bottles. The low density polyethylene, so most of your plastic bags are low density polyethylene. Polypropylene, some of your food containers will be polypropylene, the ones that you find in the groceries with the rotisserie chicken in particular. Polystyrene, all familiar with polystyrene, expanded polystyrene in particular, better known as styrofoam. It's ubiquitous. And then we have a category number 7 for everything else that doesn't fit in the first 6. And that is one of the challenges of plastics and the recycling of plastics, because not all plastics are compatible, and in the main part, you have to separate plastics for the purposes of recycling into these 7 categories. In particular, PVC and polystyrene are very incompatible with the rest. So when you're recycling PET, even if there is just a small percentage of PVC, it can contaminate all of your PET material, and it's important to note that. When we talk about plastic in the waste stream, in Latin America and the Caribbean in particular, on average, it accounts for 7 to 12% of the total waste by weight. What we need to recognize, though, is that plastic is quite voluminous, and therefore plastic pollution is much more visible than the other types of pollution, because even though it just represents a small percentage by weight, by volume, it's significantly more. For Caribbean countries in particular, although this represents an average, in some countries I've seen plastic waste quantities as much as 19 to 21% in Trinidad, for instance, and in St. Lucia. So what are some of the Caribbean initiatives? One of the things the Caribbean was quite good at was implementing a number of single-use plastic bans, starting with Antigua and Barbuda in 2016. They were one of the first islands to do so in the Caribbean. And since then, a number of others have followed suit. When the ban was introduced in Antigua and Barbuda in 2016, it was a ban on single-use shopping bags in particular. Since then, Antigua and Barbuda has gone on to implement other single-use plastic bans, including that of straws and styrofoam, and also a number of other countries have joined that. So Belize, US Virgin Islands, Colombia, Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, they have all implemented bans on different types of single-use plastics. One of the countries that haven't implemented any bans at this point in time is Trinidad and Tobago. We have spoken about it in Trinidad since 2016, the implementation of a ban on styrofoam. Unfortunately, that has not materialized just yet. Going on to other initiatives. So one of the most successful initiatives certainly in the English-speaking Caribbean is the deposit refund system that exists in Barbados. So as far back as 1986, Barbados implemented a Returnable Containers Act. And through that act, a deposit is placed on beverage containers, and that deposit is refunded when the empty beverage container is returned. And that has created quite a dynamic informal system in Barbados, where people drive around the country, cycle around the country, picking up plastic waste bottles and bringing it back to the depot. So you have a picture there of bags of plastic that have been brought in for recycling at the depot. And the system operates quite well because there's that inbuilt financial incentive in the system. One of the challenges with this is that it applies only to the items that the law covers. So in the case of the Returnable Containers Act in Barbados, it's specifically for beverage containers. Moving on to other types of Caribbean initiatives, there are some voluntary programs in a number of places. I highlighted the one in Trinidad and Tobago, the Recyclable Solid Waste Collection Project, branded ICARE, and it's the first national recycling initiative in Trinidad. And the project began in 2015 with funding from the Green Fund of Trinidad and Tobago. And it's important to recognize that that ICARE program continues to be supported by the Green Fund. And it promotes a voluntary public participation in the recovery of beverage containers for recycling. Besides this program, there are also a number of other voluntary programs taking place throughout the Caribbean, either by the governments themselves, the waste management authorities, or in some cases as part of projects supported by other countries and international and regional development agencies. One of the projects that I was particularly involved in and was quite a useful project in terms of demonstrating public-private collaboration for recycling was that of the Replace OECS, and the Replace OECS project was launched in May 2019 as a 2-year public-private initiative. It was implemented by Unite Caribbean and was aimed at setting up an incentivized plastic waste collection and recycling system. The plastic collected was exported to a recycling plant in the wider Caribbean region, in particular in Honduras, promoting a circular economy model. The first pilot project country was St. Lucia, with subsequent replication in other OECS countries, and particularly in Grenada. And the project was supported by the government of France, the OECS Commission, and some other private sector companies. That Replace project led to the development of a more substantial project, and this is a project that is currently going on, and again, Unite Caribbean is involved in this project, and it's the Recycle OECS project. It's funded by the European Union and implemented by the OECS Commission in partnership with French Development Agency, AFD. It's a 2-year project, started in January of 2023, and it supports the broader European Union Zero Waste Initiative in the Caribbean, which aims to strengthen the EU-Caribbean partnership for cooperation in the field of circular economy and solid waste management. So the project is being undertaken by a consortium comprising Eureka and Unite Caribbean. And the project aims to develop a recycling model for implementation in the OECS countries and for demonstration of that model in 2 OECS countries. The 2 countries that were selected are Dominica and Grenada, and the model itself comprises 5 pillars: a technical pillar, which deals with all the equipment, the collection systems, the shipment systems, and so forth; an economic pillar, looking at the costs of recycling, but also the cost of what would happen if we didn't recycle. The financing mechanism is the 3rd pillar, looking at all the costs that are required to achieve sustainability and agreement on who is going to pay that cost, recognizing that recycling, as nice as it sounds, at the end of the day, there's a cost to it, and I'll go into that shortly. A 4th pillar being the institutional and the regulatory one, meaning that for successful and sustainable recycling, that we have to put laws in place. It's great to have voluntary programs, and that's how we start, and that's how we get people involved. But to really ensure that recycling becomes a normal part of your daily activities, and so we do need to have those regulations in place. And of course, not pillar 5, not by any means the least of the pillars, the public education, the communications tools, the stakeholder engagements needed to change the behaviors that are required at our stage. So despite the programs that are ongoing, and I mentioned some of the programs, but there are a lot more programs going on supported by a number of different international agencies. And so the government of Taiwan is supporting a project in St. Kitts and Nevis. The IUCN has been supporting a project in Grenada, St. Lucia, and Antigua and Barbuda. The BCRC Caribbean is supporting a project in Suriname and supporting a wider Caribbean project for plastic recycling. So there are a lot of different activities going on, recognizing the challenges of plastic recycling in the Caribbean. But I wanted to talk about some of the specific challenges to recycling within the Caribbean and more broadly within small island developing states. And it has been highlighted by UNEP in their SIDS Waste Management Outlook. And it's listed here, high shipping costs. The material that is collected has to be shipped out at this point in time because there aren't sufficient volumes to generate local activity, local processing. And the shipping costs out of the Caribbean are quite high and not always optimal. Lack of responsibility beyond the export. So what happens to the product when it leaves here? It's something beyond our control, and it can end up in places that are not sustainably recycling, and you can end up dumping in other countries. And so high export taxes on recyclable waste, not particularly applicable to the Caribbean. Importing port regulations. So recyclable products can be seen as waste, and there are some regulations that may prohibit materials from going to different countries. We also have to bear in mind the Basel Convention and the requirements under that convention. Plastic has been is a commodity item, and it suffers from commodity shocks and so forth. So sometimes you have great prices, and most of the time you have very low prices, and that becomes a challenge from a financial point of view. We have high equipment operation maintenance costs here in the Caribbean. All our parts need to be imported. We also have to import sometimes the labor and expertise to do repairs and maintenance. Collection difficulties from remote islands is a big challenge. So when you have recycling in Grenada, trying to extend it to Cari-Bois and Petit Martinique and so forth, the small islands, same thing in Trinidad, and it becomes a problem because, again, of limited shipping and limited resources. And we do have limited human capacity with expertise and experience in recycling throughout our islands. So what are some of the national and local actions that we can implement to improve waste management in small island developing states? So it can be broken down in terms of governance, stakeholders, technology, and finance. So with respect to governance, we do need an overall waste management strategy, as well as clarification of roles of the public and private sectors. We need legislation and enforcement. With respect to stakeholders, we, of course, need engagement and education. With respect to technology, we need to ensure that we have the appropriate technology fit for purpose and that we have the maintenance capabilities. Too often in the Caribbean region, we start off these very lovely projects, we get equipment, sometimes the equipment is donated, and then equipment breaks down, and that's the end of the project because we don't have the expertise to maintain. And the financial component, I will deal with separate because we need to clearly understand the funding mechanisms for recycling. And I list some of them here. It can be dependent on the intrinsic value of waste. So there are some commodities, for instance, metals, where the value of waste is such that it's sufficiently high that it creates its own economy. So you have the metals recycling economy, and that is self-sustaining. Unfortunately, most of plastics, the intrinsic value of the plastic is not there, the plastic waste is not there, and therefore you can't rely on that to sustain the recycling, and therefore you have to rely on these other systems: deposit refund system, extended producer responsibility, landfill taxes, and facility fees or treatment fees. And the reality of these systems, these mechanisms, is that they must be supported by legislation. So I spoke about a deposit refund system that existed since 1986 in Barbados, and it's a fantastic system that works very well there. And that system, a number of other countries have looked at that system. Trinidad has been considering that system since as far back as 2000. There have been 5 or 6 different editions of deposit refund bills that have gone to Parliament that have been thrown out. So up to now, we have not been able to implement such a system. And similar situations exist in some of the other Caribbean islands as well: St. Lucia, Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada. They have all looked at deposit refund systems at different points in time. Another type of funding mechanism is that of extended producer responsibility, and it's something in the Caribbean we seem to shy away from. We don't want to we don't want to consider the fact that the producers themselves can be made responsible for the waste that they generate. But it's something that is very common across Europe, and there are some very extensive producer responsibility systems that exist in Europe. The Grüner Punkt system that started off in Germany and now has expanded to all the other European states is a very good example of that, where the producers themselves have been legislated to have that responsibility for their waste, and they have to ensure that the waste is properly collected and recycled. That system also exists in different provinces in Canada as well. Landfill taxes may not seem to be a way of increasing recycling, but the reality is, again, in our countries, waste disposal is a free service. So any company, any individual generating waste, they have the opportunity to dispose of that waste free of charge. And that doesn't exist in most of the rest of the world. So in the US and again in Europe, in many different parts of Asia, you have a landfill tax or landfill fee that you pay to dispose of waste. And when you have to do that, then it makes recycling more cost effective, because there might be a fee for recycling, but that fee may be less than that for disposing in the landfill, and therefore recycling becomes a financially feasible alternative. In our countries where there are no landfill taxes or there are no landfill fees, because it's cheap to drop off waste or free to drop off waste, and a recycling plant may have a fee attached to it, no one will want to pay that fee. And it just takes away from any opportunity to have recycling facilities within the Caribbean. And facility fees or treatment fees, also along those same lines, having fees for recycling, but ensuring that material must be recycled, and companies and individuals needing to pay that fee is also another mechanism to ensure that there is funding for recycling. One of the things I want to close with is that we have to remove ourselves from the myth that recycling can be a business opportunity on its own. Whilst that can happen in some countries based on the population, based on the industrial capacity and so forth, within our small island developing states, where there's a high cost of production, there's a high cost of equipment operation, and they have relatively low volumes of these products, the reality is that recycling cannot, at this point in time, be a viable business operation, and therefore it has to be supported by some external financing. And the question then becomes, who pays for this? Does the government pay for it? Do the individuals pay for it? Or is that cost applied to the private sector and to the producers who have produced the product, which ends up as waste in the first place? And that ends my presentation. So